So today at Product Coffee, we're going to be talking about outcomes over outputs. And this is a topic that's been a hot topic for a lot of product people for quite a while. And a lot of companies have made an evolution. A lot of modern product companies have started by focusing on outcomes from the very beginning. As soon as they can identify and quantify product market fit, they really start focusing very clearly on outcomes. But a lot of companies and product managers struggle to build the discipline, the intellectual discipline to actually keep the conversation focused on outcomes. And even more struggle with the challenge of keeping their leadership conversation as they're doing their quarterly, annual, weekly, monthly planning focused on the outcomes over the outputs. So we're going to talk about that today. A couple of resources I want you to know about. We've got a resources page over at productcoffee.com/resources, and it has a description of this session and a couple of links, including a survey that I would really value you taking the time to fill out when you're done. When the session ends today, and let us know what you thought about it and how we can improve these sessions. And every month we look at all those survey results and we send a book from the Product Coffee bookshelf of your choice to someone who has completed one of those surveys. So if you fill out that survey, you'll be entered into that drawing, and it helps us continue to improve the programming here as well. And we also, one of the other links you'll see on that page is a link to a notes document. And each week, one of the things that we do here, and I'd like to invite everyone to join us at productcoffee.com/notes. That'll open a Google Doc on your computer that you can star and save off into your own Google Drive. And we take notes together instead of taking individual notes. As we have a thought or hear somebody say something that was really impactful, we jot it down in a community notes document. It becomes a record of this event that you can go back to and refer to in the future as well. So please join us at productcoffee.com/notes and take notes along with the rest of us today, and drop your LinkedIn credential, LinkedIn link in there if you contribute to the notes document, so that other people can find you and thank you and connect with you offline as well. All right, so let's get started. Outputs over outcomes. And today is one of those days that we're not going to have somebody speak and tell us what we should think or what we ought to think. We're really going to focus in on what we have experienced as individuals. And I'm going to lead off. A few years ago, I was working for a pretty large company that originally started out by making meat slicers and deli equipment, and eventually moved into making things like calculators and cash registers and computers. You may know them as International Business Machines Corporation, or IBM. A lot of people don't know that they originally started out making meat slicers, so which is a pretty cool little bit of trivia. But more importantly, we were making a shift in the part of the business that I was in to adopt OKRs. And a lot of you, I think, are probably familiar with OKRs, objectives and key results. And they're a great management and business tool for focusing on the right things that were popularized by Andy Grove, or a derivative of them were popularized through Andy Grove's book. What was that? High Output Management by Andy Grove. And he really talked about using MBOs as they used them at Intel at the time, and those evolved into this OKR framework where you really focus on having a meaningful, powerful objective that you can give to your leaders and your teams to focus on, and then measurable results that would demonstrate that they were achieving that objective. That's become a really popular topic, especially among product managers over the last several years, because it's helped to shift the conversation in companies that are seeking to create more empowered development teams, to give them a framework for focusing on the important outcomes that they're seeking versus the just simple feature delivery, being told, hey, go build this thing, get it to market as quickly as possible. So I want to start that, and just kind of by a show of hands using the reaction panel down below. I want to see folks on the call, how many of you feel like you're held accountable more to outputs by show of hands? If you're really held accountable to delivering things as opposed to really thinking about the results in business and product results terms. If you're talking about when is that feature going to be delivered, what is my velocity, what's the team's velocity? If you feel like you're held more accountable to outputs, go ahead and raise your hand using the reactions panel at the bottom of your Zoom. Got a few hands coming up here. Excellent. I've had a few talks with a few folks as well on this topic, and then I think we've got quite a few people. So we've got a good split of people here. I think quite a few people are still feel that like they're held accountable to outputs, and then quite a few people are held accountable. The rest of you, I presume, are held accountable to outcomes, and you really think about results. And how many of you, by show of hands, and I'm going to clear the reactions panel real quick. And I'm curious, one more thing is how many of you don't know, aren't really sure whether you're held accountable to outputs or outcomes. It's okay. Let us know where we are. I don't see any hands on that, so I feel like people have got, go ahead.
I'm just going to verbally say sometimes it's a mix. Like if you, I have a full product portfolio and I have one huge like whole silo of it that's very much just outcomes. And I have another one where people care about the outcomes, but then at the leadership level, they've dialed into what they think are the outputs that equal that outcome. And so they keep banging me in the head with, follow up on these outputs for no good reason. Just, I'm important and I want to know a thing.
Yeah. Can you give do you have an example that you can share, recognizing privacy, of kind of some of that distinction in your business, in your
Yeah. So an example of where we're looking at outputs versus outcomes, and this will ring very close to home for George, is on the contract lifecycle management systems here at NCR that George is actually the product owner for. Thank you, George. But at an executive steering committee level, right, the outcome that we're looking at is adoption of the tool in terms of all of our contracts being not just standardized and simplified, but actually digitized into this tool. So our sales team can go in and sell a thing, and we automatically have the contract, and it will generate and populate with unique terms and conditions for that product, right? And go into this beautiful, very sexy e-sign process we're all just super stoked about, right? We all understand Adobe. It's great stuff. But when we talk about that, right, we have to have the templates for these contracts from the industry councils and from the industry sales and product teams that have inputs, and they really own the contract. My team, George, and it just leads an IT team. They get it into the tool essentially, right? So at an executive level, the outcome we're looking for is getting, excuse me, all of our contracts. It's more getting every sales interaction to be driven off of a standardized contract that was generated from the tool. So we know that the sales team isn't using some rando one off their hard drive that has outdated T's and C's. But yet we're asking to chase outputs, and I'm being asked questions like, how many templates did you deliver last month? 16? Oh, well, why wasn't it more? Well, who cares, right? That number is meaningless, right? 16 or 2. Doesn't really matter, right? We don't know how many templates there actually even are. So it's kind of an invalid metric as it is, right? The next one that comes up is, what's your percent complete? And I'm like, I don't know. Why don't you tell me? How many do you have? Oh, you can't answer that question. That's fun. Right, Jim? It's not.
Yep.
Jim's smiling and laughing.
Similarly, I saw. Yep. Similarly, I saw another hand. Jim, thinking about some of the companies you've worked with in the past, and thinking about what are the types, Jim Montgomery, what are the types of outputs, and I'm specifically focusing on outputs right now to really kind of draw a distinction between outputs and outcomes. So what are some of the outputs that you've been held accountable to in the past that really kind of help to paint the picture of what that looks like?
Well, actually, to Holly's example, one of our products that I'm working with today is a reporting engine. So the configuration of reporting templates. And again, the output is how many templates have you configured this month or this quarter, or how many will be coming in the next quarter, right? Because there are opportunities that are tied to that. But the outcome of what we're doing is we're delivering an engine that allows us to create these templates 80% faster than the way it used to be, right? So we have an outcome, we have it's it's a measurable result, and but then it gets distilled down to the outputs of how to people lose sight of that. I don't know, and maybe it's not being able to put outcomes as easily on a roadmap as we can put the outputs, right? And so people tend to focus on that, but stakeholders don't get the outcomes, right? They're looking for the outputs.
Which is really an interesting observation. And I've observed that as well in many cases, especially, in the 50s and 60s, when many people were really focused on maximizing productivity in the manufacturing space and in the industrial space. Managers were really focused on things like total quality, and TQM really got really loud in the 80s, and Kaizen got really. You don't think I was alive then? Don't I look old enough? No, I wasn't alive then, but I did read. So I did have to read a lot of stuff in my college courses. But we were really focused on maximizing throughput, and even some of the early Agile conversation really focused on how do we know Agile is working when we're talking about software development. Well, we know we're doing well if we're increasing our velocity. That was a thing that people talked about a lot, was how's your velocity, and how's your velocity improving over time? How's your accuracy in your estimates improving over time? And that became a huge measurable result. And I still talk to a lot of companies today where senior managers and directors are bonused and compensated on how on their team's delivery of story points over the course of an iteration, or over the course of a development cycle. And that's a clear measurement of output. And it's still very common in this day and age. Now, in product management, we tend to think more about the outcomes, but that's rolling up to the business level. And so one of the challenges that we want to try to help address is how to shift that conversation in the organization. And one of the things I specifically love to bang on is story points. And if I can improve my velocity in my development organization by allowing them to deliver more story points in an iteration, well, I can do that by modifying how I measure story points. I can do that by delivering a lot, and by creating a lot smaller, more granular backlog items that allow people to cycle through them faster. But that doesn't necessarily give me anything. That doesn't give me any way to measure the value that I'm creating. And that's the fundamental difference between outcomes and outputs. Outcomes is about measuring that value. So I saw quite a few hands go up when we were talking about who feels like they're measured according to outcomes more than outputs. And so what I'd really love to hear is a couple of examples of outcomes that your organization, you can genericize them as much as you need to maintain confidentiality, but I'd love to hear some examples of great outcomes that you're being held to, that you're focused on in your team today. Throw your hand up. Chris, you've got your hand up. I think that's from the earlier question about whether people are clear or not on whether they're measured over outcomes or outputs. And I'm curious where you're landing right now. Have you started to get a clearer understanding of what's important in your organization right now?
Yeah, my hand was up for the outcomes and outputs, and the velocity and the pace of the project. And someone said the stakeholders, focus on numbers. Totally agree. And it's just a lot easier to make a project plan that says we want to do 200. So how many 20s do we need to make 200? But, my context is it's a project that sort of was started as something to create a tool that would pull together disparate sources of data for a team to be able to see it in one view. And it ended up becoming like an audit of all the data sources, and ended up kind of being like, what do we need? What process do we need to update these data sources? Because we're finding discrepancies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a prime example of what we're talking about. And there are a couple of other examples here in the chat. And Jim talking about working with a PM who spoke to outcomes, but then the questions that he actually asked were around, hey, how many AHA suggestions did you respond to, or how many active client working groups were in progress? So behavior not necessarily matching the conversation there. It's a really great example. John Mansour, why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, so I think I don't necessarily have an example, but what I would like all of us to include in this discussions is to make the distinction between outcomes that are focused on our business internally and outcomes that are focused externally on customer outcomes, because I think both have a place, and at some point, happy to dive into this, but depending on which of those outcomes is your starting point, the ripple effect is significant in terms of what it means to product management. So I want to make sure we talk about the difference between those two as a starting point, because it completely changes the complexion of a lot of things.
I'm so glad you said that, John. Back to my example, like that's the argument I keep having at the ELT level is the outcome that we should be focused on isn't even an internal one when you talk about contracts, right? Why did we invest in better tools? Why are we doing this? Maybe somebody on the legal side thinks that we want to make sure that the sales guy isn't using the old one because it doesn't have the right terms, but that's really saying something different, right? It's the customer experience, right? We want to make it easier and faster for our customers to sign a contract, right? We want to change their experience. We want to make sure that they have the latest contract because X, right? That impacts the customer, not keeps Jim Bedore, the head of the law department, feeling like he can sleep good at night after his scotch, right? That's great, but that's not what we're here for, really.
Well, that's exactly it. And so to that outcome is we are trying to create a better customer experience from soup to nuts. It's like, okay, the sales process was great. Now the contract process is a nightmare. You don't want to have that hiccup in the process, right? You want customers to feel good through the point that they actually sign that contract and keep going with a great customer journey.
Right. Now I got emailed 5 different versions because the sales guy realized he kept pulling the wrong one from his hard drive and just kept sending me more of them. And now I don't know. I've seen these email threads are great. And they're like, which one do I sign? Because they've gotten like 5. Right. That's what we're trying to get rid of. Right. It's about the customer, to your point, like the external outcome, not but we keep talking about even at the outcome level, the internal one, and then the outputs around that. So sorry.
Well, and here's the issue when we as product people, when our starting point is, how do I help my company get better at something? What by default, that means customer value comes secondary. How do I grow the adoption of my product, right? How do I improve retention? And we start thinking about what do we need to do to our product instead of thinking, so forget about those metrics for just a minute. They're important, but it's like, how do we make our customers better at something that's really important to their success? And then the second question is, will that result in faster adoption, higher retention, more sales, whatever internal metric we're looking for? And I think that's, it might seem like semantics, but so many conversations I hear and things I read about with outcomes, it's focused on what we do as product managers and how we create outcomes that are valuable to our own business. And there's like no talk about customer outcomes that make them better, right? And philosophically, it's our job is to make customers better at something, and the end result is like great killer products. But that's, I'm like, people look at me when I have 3 heads sometime when I say that, and then, you start going through the examples like, oh, wow, yeah, why aren't we doing that?
Yep, and I love the way you brought that up, and that kind of leads me to so as we mentioned, reading Continuous Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres right now, and one of the things that she talks about in that book is she breaks down in this discussion about outcomes in general. She breaks down 3 different. She kind of calls out 3 different ways of measuring outcomes or types of outcomes that people tend to measure, and their business outcomes is one of them, and that's really kind of more at the strategic level. So for example, we want to increase sales of a certain product as an outcome, maybe sell more dog food, I think is the specific example that she gives. And then you have the notion of product outcomes. which is the next layer below that. And this is where we as product people tend to spend most of our time if we're able to do so and if we're successful in doing so, because we're talking about how does this product, what can we do in the product to influence that business outcome? And the product outcomes tend to be leading indicators of the business outcomes. So the example that Teresa gives in that book is we want to increase the number of dogs who like our dog food. And if we can increase the number of dogs who like our dog food, then we'll likely increase the increase the sales of our dog food. It becomes a leading indicator. So we can think about how we can measure that, how we can influence the product to improve that likability by the dogs. But then we have the question of how do we even know, how do we even measure if we're doing that, if we're likely to do that? And that brings us to the notion of tracking metrics. And tracking metrics are the things that we can measure really quickly or well instrumented in some way to actually see, are things being used successfully? And that might be a tracking metric on, do dogs eat our dog food faster than they eat another dog food? Do they they choose our dog food over another dog food? And given two bowls side by side, that would be a traction metric. And that gets into what you're talking about, I think, John, is really kind of breaking down outcomes is such a big topic. How do we break it down into the pieces that matter that we can actually create the right influence for and focus on the right things at the product level? And I think to your point, this is where product managers can really drive the conversation.
You're right, but let's go back to that example because I don't think we're at the right outcome yet. So in the dog food example,
okay,
the outcome we wanted was what? We want more dogs to like our food?
The outcome, the business outcome was we want to sell more dog food.
Right.
The product outcome is we want more dogs to like our dog food.
Okay. So I think there's still an opportunity to take that outcome and direct it more toward the end customer, because if we want more dogs to like our food, so we sell more dog food, how do we get more dogs to like our food? Which really means how do we make the people who own those dogs want to buy that dog food for their dogs?
Right.
So there's a whole other set of outcomes that are about the dog and the people who own and care for these dogs that's not in that discussion. And I think what we get into, because in my mind, that's still an internally focused outcome. If all of us are product managers in this dog food company, there are too many right answers to how we get more dogs to like our food, and we end up competing with one another. If we would just look at what is best for the dogs themselves and the people who care for these dogs and own these dogs do, then I think we're all on the same page in terms of the role each of our products play in this portfolio of dog food. And then our marching orders are pretty straightforward. I mean, am I barking up the wrong tree here?
I don't think so. And I would add, I think there's a couple of ways to, forgive the term, skin the cat, right? But does the dog liking the food is that really an important part, right? I know I put this in the chat as a joke, but seriously, like, I'm thinking personally as someone who owns a bunch of cats. I've decided that they like grain-free, high-protein Blue Buffalo. I have no reason to think that they like this, but they're probably sitting there looking at me going, Mom, we'd really like the just cat chow, right? It's like Cheetos. We'd really rather just eat Cheetos. That'd be great. Just hand them over. But I've decided this is better for them. So this is what I'm buying, right? So there could be different drivers beyond just the animal, right? The dog liking the food. But I think we'd have to delve into, to kind of your point, John, especially if we have this amazing team of a lot of product people. We have the resources to really delve into what are all the different drivers that move that needle, right, of selling more dog food, right?
Well,
How do
precisely, right?
Can we
Because
put a gluten-free label on it? Can we say it's, I don't know, cage-free? I mean,
you'd rather spend it on the health of your animal than on the vet.
right?
Bottom line, right?
Yep. I love Jeff. I love the hand grenade Jeff threw into the conversation. Jeff Meddy commented in the chat, said, if we look at this as a B2B scenario, then what we actually is this is a lot more like a B2B scenario in that the human, and David jumped in, the human is the buyer while the dog is the user. And so measuring outcomes becomes even more complex. And I think that's some of the commentary you're getting to, John, is really kind of leaning into the complexity that we create with this specific example, as opposed to a direct to consumer example where the user is also the buyer.
Well, yeah, and in B2B, we have to make, there's, I look at it very simply in 3 layers. We have to do things to make users better at their job measurably. We have to be able to measure that they're better at their job in ways that improve the performance of whatever department they work in. And we have to improve the performance of one or more departments in that organization enough to impact something that's strategic to the organization at the C level, right? So if you want to take it bottom up, I think that's how we have to think as product managers, is not just is it valuable to the user, is it valuable to the user in ways that are valuable to the company?
Yep. Yep, absolutely. Jerry, you've had your hand up for a minute. Why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, there was another data point that on Teresa's story, as I recall, and that was that it was a subscription service and people would buy and then cancel. And the reason for cancellation was the dog wouldn't eat the food, which I think is what drove well, if the dogs aren't eating the food, how do we get the dogs to eat the food? So it gets back to the user, like the buyer is making the decision, but the end user has influenced the buyer by not eating.
Mm-hmm.
Fair point. And maybe the dog's just on a diet.
Yeah. My daughter's response to that is just leave the food out long enough. She will get hungry. She will eat.
No, I had a dog.
One way to
too.
make it happen.
That's what the vet told me for my dog. She's like, she's just waiting for something better. She thinks that you'll feed her human food if she doesn't eat this. So just
My dog has me trained very well.
Yes, I guarantee if I give you if I cut up a piece of steak and put it down in one bowl and put kibble in the other bowl, my dog's going to go for the steak first. Faith, you got your hand up. Oh, you're still on mute.
I kind of just wanted to sort of pull back, zoom back out from the specifics of the dog food example to I think the point you were kind of putting on the table, Jason, which was about how a lot of times when companies define outcomes, even if they're customer facing outcomes, they are relying on lagging indicators instead of leading indicators. So for the product team to actually be able to iterate quickly, experiment quickly, make quick decisions about what's working and what's not working, and really learn as fast as possible whether the solution that they're trying to pursue is going to have an impact, positively or negative, on those, on the lagging indicators, that it's necessary to kind of dig a little bit deeper and figure out what traction metrics can be devised that are going to, provide that insight into the bigger picture, so that you don't have to wait till the quarterly revenue numbers come in or whatever. So I think that's useful to kind of pull back out to and think about, even for people on the call who are currently measured by outcomes. Do you think that the outcomes that you're being held accountable to are more in that lagging indicator space, or do you feel like that you are using outcomes, or maybe does anyone have an example of some outcomes that they have applied that actually are, kind of more leading indicators or in that sort of traction category that teams can sort of use in process instead of kind of waiting for all the, behaviors and stuff to bubble up and, show up on a, maybe on a revenue report or something? Because I think that's a really important distinction that she made. Our company has goals that they want to achieve. They have revenue growth goals, whatever. So ideally, one of the goals expected from product is that we deliver capabilities that will increase revenue, either by encouraging people to renew or by driving new sales. So leaving aside a minute whether any new capability, whether a new deal can actually be traced to that new capability we created or not, leaving that aside, that's still a pretty lagging indicator. It doesn't help me evaluate different solutions I might consider, because by the time we know whether or not new deals actually were made, and our sales and contract cycle is pretty long, it could be 6 to 12 months before we know. And then and then we really don't have a way to know which thing we introduced is the thing that created that, that moved the needle on that metric. So, anyway, I'm interested in if other folks also have found kind of traction metrics that give them more in-process insight.
I used to also have I worked with a VP of development who really worked with his teams very well on even distinguishing between leading indicators and what he called headlight metrics. And I think that's what those traction metrics are. He called them headlights that weren't even necessarily leading indicators, but they were things that you could see down the road that would give you a hint of what was coming down the road. But you still have to interpret it. You don't necessarily, it's not necessarily the answer in and of itself. And I want to back up in the chat, David, because I think this all kind of comes together in a really interesting way. David was giving an example of Toyota's implementation of Kaizen. And David, could you speak to that for just a minute for me about that example and how that ties together with this notion of business, product, and traction metrics?
Well, I was just, that was kind of when earlier on when we're kind of cracking open this topic of outputs and outcomes and either or, and sometimes they're aligned. I mean, sometimes, output is the outcome. It's like, we need to make more stuff, that's that could be their OKR. So they may have been optimizing for that a bit, maybe a bit for safety, maybe a bit for quality, but maybe a bit for throughput, so that could have been one of their OKRs. That was my only point. And I think in modern days, I guess I was comparing that to like when we're on a different product development cycle. We're cranking out products. Like we might build a product in 9 months or a year, like one digital product. We may be trying to like launch an app or something like that. We're not trying to make thousands of cars a year. So the outputs, I guess management's looking for ways to measure value creation, with my other little comments in there, like they're looking for some way to measure it, and a lot of times these conversations turns into kind of a soft gauge of like, well, how valuable was that comment? How valuable was it to go take a step back, or the whole, all these theories of like move slow to move fast, stuff like that. It's like, that's tricky sometimes for management to embrace and support. But ultimately you have faith that the outcomes are going to prevail. And a lot of times it's not that hard to have those conversations. For me, it often comes back to like the user goals and business goals a little bit. Aligning those things helps to snap it into focus a bit. Let's make sure we're creating a product that people really want first and foremost, because if we don't have that, we don't have a business. So I don't know, kind of a bunch of thoughts in there, but I'm just trying to elaborate.
That absolutely gets into, I think, making sure that we're focused on the right outcomes. And I think, that John's been very, very keenly focused on, are we just focused on internally focused outcomes? Are we thinking about customer outcomes, and are we measuring the right outcomes to begin with? And where I wanted to take this conversation, I think we've done a really good job of kind of looking at the big picture and the distinctions and some really interesting examples. But where I really wanted to take this conversation and make sure that we got to was a place where we have a mental playbook for making sure that we as product managers and as the conscience of our company, as product people, are driving the right discipline and discussion around the right outcomes for our business, as opposed to focusing on just the outputs. And I would even assert that outputs are still valuable when those outputs are specifically that metric, that traction metric, or that tactical metric to determine our ability to deliver on the outcomes. I rail on story points and sprint velocity quite a bit, because I see that often become the be all end all for someone. I've seen it too often where that's the pure focus. But when you pull back, that's even intended to represent an outcome. But when we lose track of the outcome, story point and velocity become a very weak, poor metric, because the outcome that's intended to actually drive is higher quality, faster delivery of value, not just delivery of code, but delivery of value. And if we're cycling through, if we've got increasing velocity, that means we're getting better at delivering value faster. But if we're not measuring that outcome, if we're not measuring the value, then we can't actually tell if those story points are useful at all in the first place. And I read an article not too long ago, and I'm going to paste a link to it here in the chat. It was over on Medium, but the author made an assertion that the product manager's job is to instigate leadership to define and create alignment on the goals that need to be achieved. The team then sets out which opportunities can be explored that are most likely to give a good result. And I think one of the challenges that I've seen people face so much that I really want to kind of get into some tactics for improving the landscape on is when I see product managers, especially, coming into an organization early in their own onboarding. They're handed a to-do list. Here's the feature that we need to deliver. And it becomes a very quick, a very easy conversation. Okay, my job is to define and deliver this feature that somebody has already decided is going to deliver an outcome. But great product managers do something different than mediocre product managers. And they immediately dig into not just understanding what it is that needs to be delivered, but sitting down with those leaders and creating a conversation to create that alignment on why this feature is important in the first place. We say over and over again, ask why until you're blue in the face. One of the people I have seen in countless conversations in the Product Coffee Premium group, I've seen Faith Peterson on this call actually live that over and over and over again. When somebody's come into a conversation and said, hey, I'm trying to solve this problem, she digs into the why and what are you trying to drive and what is the outcome that you're looking for. And we can all learn from that, because as product people, I see the strongest actually do that. They sit down with their leaders and they hold them accountable to not just the feature, but asking, who is my customer? What is the business outcome that we're trying to achieve here? And why do you think this feature will help us achieve that business outcome? Help me understand why this is important, because that opens up my ability to have a conversation to come up with even better ideas. And Faith, as I've been bragging on Faith, you had a comment in here. You want to jump in here and tell us what you had to say, Faith, about velocity?
I don't want to sidetrack the discussion on it too much because it's a little bit of a tangent, but basically, people tend to think velocity is for something that it's not really for. And the main point of velocity is to let the delivery team have some visibility into their own activities so that they can try to achieve a consistent cadence of work, so that they're not, working too hard, so that they're not working too little, and to create a little bit of predictability. A side effect of a consistent velocity is that they can give stakeholders like product managers some degree of predictability, but not an absolute degree. So it's not meant to be something that people try to increase or make the velocity number higher. It's the best velocity is a consistent one that the team is able to achieve. So I think part of the problem with people try to use velocity as an outcome because they don't really understand what it's for, or they're trying to use it for something because it is a measurement that's available, even though it is not actually suited, to your point, Jason, it's not really suited to, it doesn't show what people want it to show, but it is something that is often available for some teams. So sometimes people fall back on what numbers do I have as opposed to what numbers should I want or should I try to be creating. So that's my velocity soapbox. But
yeah, and I think we could have a whole discussion even on using velocity in more effective ways. I think we can get on soapboxes and dominate Hyde Park for a couple of hours in the UK if we want to do that. That's a great point, and thank you. John, you said you have a couple of client examples where their metrics and outcomes were actually measurements of customer success. And I'd love you to talk about those a little bit, and not only the examples themselves, but maybe your insight into how they got to the point that those were being socialized and understood across the organization, and how that was driven.
So, and this goes to my point, when I was introducing myself today about how we simplify product management. So this one client, I literally started working with them when they were like a 20-person startup, probably not even doing 2-3 million. And I think this goes to the culture of the company. So their product was point of sale software for car washes and quick lubes, and a lot of marketing and sort of customer success stuff around that. So and I think it went as high as the mission of the organization. Okay, so it started at the top, it says, our mission is to help our customers wash and or service more cars and sell more services per visit. Okay, so the ultimate measure of their success was their customer success. So from a product management standpoint, we sit here as product managers and say, okay, what are the next biggest obstacles standing in the way of more volume or selling more services when people come to a car wash or quick lube? And it drove their priority. So let me give you the real statistics here, because this is mind-blowing. So they had actual customer metrics that their customers washed 40% more cars than the industry average. Okay. And at a average per price ticket that is significantly higher, right? So think about yourself in a sales role selling this software. I go, hey, Jason, you're going to open up, 6 car washes in Atlanta. You're going to give me $1. You're going to get $1.40 back. We got a deal? Okay. This company did not discount their software. There were no discounts. People would squawk, oh, it's the end of the year. No discounts, right? Because the value metrics were there. They did not discount. Their customer retention rate was like 99 point something%. And the only ones they lost were ones that, car wash got bought up by somebody else using a different piece of software. But again, from a product standpoint, it simplified the prioritization of everything, because their job and the culture, everybody had to go out to a car wash and a quick lube and understand how they ran their business, blah, blah, blah. So this company went from like nothing to 100 million in a very few short years, and it was all organic. They didn't acquire anyone because of that value, right? And so again, their priorities were just, what are the next biggest things to help our customers wash more cars and or sell more services per visit? The other customer, they did skills testing, so hard skills testing. So for like people in call center, salespeople, IT people, so on and so forth. Again, culture of the company, mission of the company was, we want our customers to be able to, it was something like this. We want our customers to be able to measure the impact on the organization's goals of the people they hire. Okay. So because we're going to test people for skills in certain areas, we want to make sure that the impact of who you hire shows up on your top and bottom lines. Things are important to the company. You would not believe the number of testimonials they had. And so the developers or the engineers in their organization were organizational psychologists who were creating tests for various roles and skills. And you could see how they'd get off on tangents. Oh, this would be a great test. This would be a great test. I was like, which tests are going to help me hire people with a better prediction of success in this role that's going to impact a metric that is valuable to the customer's organization? Okay, and so it frames what we have to do as priorities for product people, right? And so it's a little bit of reverse thinking. It's like, what's the next biggest obstacle we have to remove to give customers that value? And then can we take it to a market? Can we take it to market in a way that is valuable to our company? Can we get the revenue, the profitability, the retention, whatever it is? And it seemed to just simplify what they do.
So the question that I have on that example, and let's just take that second example, because I think it's a really good one. Did they start with that perspective, or is that a perspective and a discipline that evolved with them over time? Did they start out by asking that question to begin with, or they start out in a less mature way?
Well, I think at some point when the CEO came in, who was there when I was working with this particular client, I think when he came in, it was a culture change. You know, before it was back to the outputs. How many organizational tests can we create? How many skill tests can we create for all the different skills, right? It's volume, 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 instead of saying, how do we help our customers tie the success of their company to the people they hire and be able to measure that? And it just, pardon my French, it just cut the shit and got everybody focused on what's really important to the customer. And, you know, there weren't a whole lot of debates or you know, competition among product managers for what's what, because like I said, it's like, if you look at what the customer's priorities are, it tells us what role each of our products play in the grand scheme of that. And the priorities of where our products play shift over time based on what's most important to the customer.
So it sounds like it was a top-down driven change in that specific example.
It is.
So,
another statistic real quickly here, Jason, is these companies. So I've seen, you know, we've gone through a couple of recessions in the last 20 years. They still grow, maybe not at a fast rate, some at a higher rate, but it's been literally, I could count them on one hand, the number of companies that operate with that culture. They still grow when the economy's bad.
So what about when we are in an environment where that top-down change isn't happening, where that top-down conversation is still output focused? What have you seen individual contributors do that have helped drive change in that conversation over time?
I think that is the biggest opportunity in front of our profession as product manager, because it all starts with us. And I think we have to start leading with some very good examples of how we do that, right? So when someone says, hey, Jason, what's on the roadmap? It's not just, hey, here's a new enhancement to payroll. It's over the next 6 months, we're going to help our clients use payroll to do a better job of recruiting and differentiating good talent by giving them different options to pay their employees.
Yeah. We had a great conversation. Exactly. And I think it's changing the way you answer the question. And if you've ever done any media training, that's the first thing that your PR experts will tell you. When the reporter asks you a question, reframe the question into the question that you want to answer. And I think that's what you just kind of hit the nail on the head on right there, John, is when the question is, when are you going to deliver these features? Or what does your roadmap look like? What are you going to deliver over the next quarter? When you answer the question, instead of what feature am I going to deliver, and you change to, well, we're trying to influence this metric. We're trying to influence this outcome. We're trying to create satisfaction for this customer, for this segment. We're trying to improve results for these specific customers in this area over the next quarter. And this is how we're tracking it. And we're working on some things that we believe are going to do that, but we're doing evaluation to validate that we're going to get those results. We're testing and experimenting. It starts to change that conversation. It starts to change that conversation in a really powerful way by getting your leaders to talk about those outcomes. We had a few months ago, Melissa Perry came and spoke to us, and she talked about one of the biggest insights that she had when she moved from being an individual contributor product manager into a vice president or chief product officer role and started attending the board meetings and listening to the board members. And the things that those board members and those C-suite executives were caring about had absolutely nothing to do with velocity. They were caring about the impact to the key business metrics. And what she saw was how great product leaders and great contributors were able to reframe and stop talking about things like minimum viable product and delivery of features and talk about this is the thing that we are working on learning and validating and proving out over the next quarter and de-risking our investments by creating that learning so that we can drive greater sales of this product down the road and make sure that we're penetrating this market in a better way. And here's what we've just done to influence that metric. And here's what we're doing over the next quarter to influence that metric. changing the conversation into the why, even when you're not asked about the why, is where we see that leadership happen.
And I think you're on point, Jason, because the first part of the answer is here's what we're doing to give customers measurable value. And the second part of the answer is here's how it influences metrics that are important to us. I think you need both parts to that answer. But when you lead with here's the value to the customer and why it's important to them, it takes a whole bunch of questions off the table. And then you say, here's what it means to us.
Yep.
It keeps everything simple. Trust me on this one, I promise you. I've seen this happen in enough situations to know that it is way easier than what a lot of us are doing.
Yeah. Well, we are right up at 1 o'clock, and I think we could have kept going on this. I know some people have had to drop to run to other meetings, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we will look forward to seeing you back at Product Coffee next week. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks.
See
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.